Thank you again for coming. Welcome, Bruchim Habaim. So we have a very powerful program for you this morning, a morning of Palestinian-Israeli dialogue. And it's actually morning for Rabbi Shaul Judelman as well, because he's in Toronto visiting family. But it's evening for Noor Awad in Bethlehem. An important time for this program, coming less than 3 months since the latest round in Israeli-Palestinian fighting in Gaza and in the streets of Israel, and that really exposed such difficult tensions among Jewish and Arab Israelis, possibility of further conflict in the West Bank, and this deepening ideological divide among American Jews on the conflict and ongoing conversation and events. For those of you who were not able to come last May to our talk with Yossi Klein Halevi on that situation, it's posted on our website. I invite you to go there and to watch it. I think now is especially a relevant time for us to have and to witness an honest and functioning and hopeful dialogue, and to hear about grassroots initiatives that don't easily fit into all of our political boxes that we see in our media and that we are taught. And so, as I mentioned in my email to the congregation last week, Rabbi Shaul Judelman was one of just 2 guests at Rachel and my wedding, who we both knew independently before meeting. Shaul was a dear friend of both of ours. So Shaul was from Seattle. Rachel spent many years, but they met when she went to college at Pitzer near Los Angeles. And I met Shaul in Nepal when I was working for Tevel B'Tzedek, an Israeli humanitarian aid organization. And Shaul was brought in as an environmental activist and teacher and social justice teacher. And Rachel and I both know him in that capacity as an ecological activist and also as a peace activist. He now lives in Tekoa, a settlement in the Gush Etzion, and a peace activist and co-founder of Roots. And Noor Awad, we're so pleased to have you with us as well. Moved from a refugee camp in Jordan to Beit Sahur in the West Bank during the Oslo Accords. He's an activist and licensed tour guide who gives geopolitical tours in Bethlehem. And he has been working with Roots since 2016 and speaks about his experiences of living under the occupation. So finally, what I wanted to do is encourage everyone, maybe after this, or even if you have a little window open, to go to the Roots website for their shared values and principles, which I found just really powerful and interesting. And I just wanted to mention a few of their highlights from my point of view of their shared values and principles. One of the recognition and the support of each other's identity on all its levels, equality of civil, political, and national rights for Palestinians and Israelis, working within a broken reality without accepting it, working on a local level to address systemic problems, community engagements. So there's a lot more. I'm just so delighted to have both of you here with us today. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to keep everybody on mute. We'll have an opportunity for questions later, but you can start to put in your questions into the chat. So Noor and Shaul, I'll leave it to you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Adir, and thank you. Also, a special thank you for a sensitive introduction, and an introduction that I'll put as one of our best in terms of approaching such a sensitive topic for all of us, where even words and place names can arouse controversy, and also first thank you for your friendship as well, which also is part of what made this event possible. And like Rabbi Adir said, Noor and I are chiming in normally separated by about 5 kilometers. Today we're about 5,000 kilometers, but the work goes on. And since COVID and we started using the Zoom format for kind of explaining Roots work, talking about what we're doing on the ground, we realized it's a bit different having this experience from every person's living room or bathroom, who knows, as opposed to being with us on the ground in our center. So as a way of a little bit bridging that gap, one of Roots' earliest successes was that there was a rabbi in the Gush Etzion area who was also a filmmaker, And he wanted to do a film about kind of what he would like to call just a kind of a on-the-ground take-it life in our area. And he chose the junction nearby, the Gush Etzion junction. And so he wanted to just kind of follow what happens there. And he heard about Roots, and he ended up following Roots in the first about 2 years, our first 2 years of programming, and created a feature documentary film. It played in Dal Aviv, one of the Israeli documentary films. I'm just going to use it as a way of just bringing a little bit onto the ground. So hopefully this is going to work. So we'll screen share. It's 2 minutes of and of course, okay. So let's go from our page here to here. I'll go full screen, and let me know if the audio is working. If you can hear the music, please make a thumbs up.
We can't hear anything. When you share, you might want to start again and share, and make sure the 2 boxes are clicked at the bottom after you share. So maybe unshare and then
I'll share, stop share.
So when you click share screen, there's 2 boxes to check at the bottom: optimize video and screen and share sound at the bottom after you press the button before you click your file.
Share sound. Okay, great. Okay. Thank you. Always learning.
אנחנו נמצאים כאן באדמה של המשפחה שלי. כשבאתי לכאן והחלטתי להקים מרכז פלסטיני שלי אלימות, אני מצפה שיתקפו אותי גם בחברה שלי וגם באוכלוסייה של המתנחלים. אבל אני יודע, כל עוד שאנחנו לא מדברים עם הימין, השמאל לא יעשה שלום.
The first time I had heard someone talk about being in Israeli jail, someone talking about suffering under occupation.
וזה שאני מכבד אותך, זה הכבוד שאני מכבד את עצמי כשאני מסתכל על עצמי בראי.
We believe that religion has to be part of the solution.
Allahu Akbar. Adonai hu Elohim.
יהודים ניצודים בארץ ישראל כמו חיות, ממש. פשוט צדים אותם. רואים רכב, איפה הם? איפה השותף? איפה האח?
אתה יושב על הכלכלה שלי, אתה יושב על הבית שלי, אתה יושב על הלב שלי, אבל לא כשותף.
האם אתה מוכן להודות שהישיבה שלך פה היא ישיבה של פשע? וממילא תגיד לי מבחינה פוליטית.
The Jewish people, that we own this land? We don't own this land. We belong to this land. And the Palestinian people also belong to this land.
אנחנו האחרונים בעולם שצריך לשבת אחד עם השני. באתי לבקש לדרוש איתה מחברים. מפני שאת ואני סבלנו שלא חיפשנו את זה לפני.
So, also for me, that helps. So my name is Shaul Judelman. Myself and Khalid Abu Awad are co-directors of Roots, Palestinian-Israeli initiative, working very much on the ground. And Noor and I also work a lot together within the leadership of Roots, and also a lot of meeting groups, and a lot of also just addressing things on the ground. And Roots' work, and what we're going to get to talking about later about what the organization does, and our kind of our perspective as an organization is really built upon the stories of a lot of individuals who've gone on some pretty transformative journeys. I think most people hear about Roots say, what? Who's sitting at the table? Religious Zionist settlers with Muslim Palestinian refugees. Those are, in a sense, the last people who work together in projects. And in a sense, picking up, I think a lot of people involved in Roots, it's a relatively new initiative. We started about 7.5 years ago. And you know, in that last frame of the video there, where Ali said, we're the last people in the world who could talk to each other. But we're suffering because we haven't talked to each other. Last Friday night, I remember I was lying in bed after kind of whatever, not falling asleep, and thinking about a podcast about the conversations that don't happen, that need to happen but don't happen. And obviously the world's full of those conversations. And Israel-Palestine is no different. Also within Israeli society, within Palestinian society, there's all of these ideological or identity divides, I'd call them, upon which we rarely manage to bridge. And so Roots starts from there, and for any of that work to happen, it starts obviously with people's individual stories, people's individuals who lead those conversations, who get into those conversations. So, and while we can look at how Israel-Palestine, what's stuck, what's the conflict about, and all kinds of things, but I think one thing that's crystallized at Roots is this very focus on our identities. And how do we bring our identities to the table? And to get to identities, Noor and I are both just going to share a bit of our own personal stories that I hope reflect a little bit on some of the, I think, the identity issues the identities that are at stake in the experience. Then we'll open up, we'll talk a little bit about what Roots does on the ground, and then really open up for a conversation with you and wherever you want to take questions, comments alike. So I'll go back a little personal for myself. I'm 42. I was born in London to South African parents, and we moved to America. I arrived to Seattle, Washington. I grew up also in a conservative synagogue with 2 passports and a question of where the heck am I from? And growing up as a young kid, I remember, also my last name is Judelman, which means Jewish man, of course. Israel always felt on some level like an answer to that question, even though it wasn't my personal home. But on some way, I felt if there's one place in the world where we're from, that's where it is. And in 1987, my uncle left Israel. He moved to the States, and he lived with us during the times of the first Intifada, the first Palestinian uprising. Being a young kid watching the news when the Gulf War happened and the Scud missiles were landing, calling our cousins what's going on. Always a sense of place and connection, but really with not much knowledge beyond that. And I came to Israel in 1995 I was in a USY summer program, summer pilgrimage in Israel, and had an amazing time. Felt incredibly connected. Felt something very powerful, and I kind of walked away from that. It was the Oslo era. You know, there was hope in the air. There's also fear already of suicide bombs, and Rabbi's assassination was around the corner, and I left that trip with 2 conclusions. One is I have to go back to Israel, and number 2, I'm never going on a group trip ever again. And I knew the next time I come to Israel, I just need to be free to get off the bus and go follow what comes up. So when I was in university, with Rachel, Rabbi Deer's wife, in Pitzer College, and I think we were actually maybe even in the same study program, the International Intercultural Studies major. And part of the requirements was to spend a semester abroad. And people in university were choosing to go as far, Nepal, Namibia, Zambia, but for me, it was clear before I'm going to go meet some other culture, I'd best come back to Israel, understand better my own, what does this Jewish journey mean? What does it mean to be part of this people? What does the land mean? And for me personally too, with all respect to synagogue staff, synagogue's great. Hebrew school was swell. But I really, the question is, something more to this Judaism? What happens when, so much of Judaism does talk about the land of Israel and the commandments there. What happens when you put Judaism back on the land? What does that look like? And that's really what I came looking for. And just like this summer, actually, it's probably about a little earlier than this, I arrived in Israel in the beginning of August 2000, a month before Rosh Hashanah, before New Year's. And that year, like this year, was about to be a sabbatical year, a Shemitah year, the 7th year in the 7-year cycle. And what I was really looking for in coming to Israel was a Judaism connected back to the land. So I'd heard about a kibbutz that did both organic farming and was a religious kibbutz. So I figure religious people connected to their tradition, and they're connected to the land. This will somehow give me some sense of the answer of what does Judaism look like when you put it back in the land. And when I got to the kibbutz, there was a raging debate actually about what the kibbutz will do during sabbatical. Sabbatical year, right? The 7th year, where we have a commandment not to work the land, and rather to let the land grow and be as it is, and whatever the crops grow are free. You can't make a profit off of them. You can't sell them at market. And for a kibbutz, it's, I think, 75% of their income annually is from agriculture. That's a big deal. How do you survive? And really, since the 1920s or even the 1880s, modern Zionist period, Jews have been re-asking this question of what do we do during the sabbatical year? And the answer has always been, at least since the kibbutz was founded in the 20s, there's no way we can fulfill this commandment these days. Israel back in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s had no export market. Whatever people grow, we were eating. But by the year 2000, the economies change. You can definitely export some Intel processors, import cucumbers, will be fine. And the kibbutz also did kind of an economic survey for the kibbutz. They saw, as a kibbutz, we will be able to survive a year without agriculture. There's some government funds that support families or communities that do keep the sabbatical year. And they said, we could actually keep it for the first time and fulfill this biblical commandment, dedicate the year to what it's supposed to be there for charity, for Jewish learning. And I was all psyched to come, work the land and The first thing they tell me is it's like a long Shabbat, no work in the land this year. But there's another voice in the kibbutz that said like this. They said, it's true, we kibbutz members will survive financially. But what about the people we employ? The Sdei Eliyahu, the kibbutz I was on, is next to Beit Sha'an. The Beit Sha'an Valley is a very poor part of the country. And there's about 60 or so people from Beit Sha'an that worked on the kibbutz. And they said, if we have no agriculture next year, we're going to lay all these peoples off. And to take away people's salaries in the name of Shemitah, that's the opposite. They said, there's no way we can stand and look them in the face for the sake of this mitzvah. That's not the holy thing to do. So long story short, the kibbutz decided to yes, work the land by nominally selling the land. I won't get into it. But I, as a young Jew on the kibbutz, watching this transpire, was really blown away. Because if you ask me what is Judaism, I'm sure we all have 100 answers to that question, but I think about, kosher and holidays and Shabbat and prayers and tradition, charity, of course, community. But the way that the kibbutz was dealing with this commandment was something else entirely. Shemitah, it's not a mitzvah like I knew. Shemitah is an economic vision. It's a vision of an economic vision for a just society. And I realized, in diaspora, I always lived my Judaism as my own personal practice, my family traditions, my community or synagogue traditions. What's going on the land when you face this commandment is a world of what's my responsibility to the people in the town and these economic questions. And a lot of things really started shifting. It awoke into me a tremendous questioning about what is Judaism. I ended up in yeshiva a few months later. I'll get to that. But it also really rebirthed for me an identity that I always held on to, but I'd held on to the old version, which I think is also a very controversial word in this point in time, is Zionism. For many very young students on college campuses, the word Zionism is no longer the simple word we knew as a part of our Jewish story. It's a very tricky word for these days. And whereas Zionism 100 years ago was, of course, it's not going well for the Jews in Lodz or in Kamenetsky or anywhere. It's time to go home, bring our Jewish people back to our homeland and create a Jewish society. By the year 2000, or by now 2021, we're back. we're home. We have an amazing country going on. There's definitely issues and there's questions, but so what does Zionism mean today? And for me, that question of what does Judaism have to offer to the questions of a modern state? And how do we as a Jewish state deal with the questions that are the real questions today? And while it's still an important question, if you take your milk spoon and drop it in the meat soup, definitely call Rabbi Adir and find out what to do. But what's a just economy? What's a Jewish take on how we design a just economy in a state is also a very important question. And that's my Zionism today, I think, is about how we as a state of Israel face the questions, and not as a theocracy. I think one of the blessings of Israel is we can finally face each other with religious, secular, all the different parts and put this puzzle and take away the monopoly that this is Judaism or that is Judaism, but deal with it and yell at each other about it, which we do, and as you all know. But that really grabbed me, and I'd say the last 21 years in Israel have been a lot about those questions of Jewish values and in Jewish society. But I want to go back to Rosh Hashanah. So Rosh Hashanah came, that began the Shemitah year, and we had the weekend. I think it was a Shabbat, Saturday, Sunday, Rosh Hashanah. We had the weekend off from kibbutz. So I went to Jerusalem to go experience Jerusalem and experience Rosh Hashanah in Jerusalem. I remember getting off the bus and just hearing sirens and ambulances going by and police units and special forces and all flooding down to the old city. If you remember Rosh Hashanah, the year 2000, Tafshin Samech Aleph, the day after Ariel Sharon went onto the Temple Mount, which was in the breakdown of the Camp David talks, and Ehud Barak announces that there's no partner. Arafat's walked out of the negotiations. Sharon, in the midst of this, decides to make a statement because, of course, there had been an offer to put Jerusalem in the old city, perhaps even on the table and Sharon said, I'm going to make a statement that Jerusalem, the old city, the Har HaBayit, the Temple Mount, Khan al-Sharif, that's the most sacred site to the Jewish people, and I have the right to go there. And he indeed went up to the Temple Mount with about 150 armed guards, and the protests and the violence, whatever happened there broke out. The next day there were riots all across the country. And I remember when Rosh Hashanah finished and we took the bus back to kibbutz, I think we got stopped on the road because there were shots fired. The second Intifada, the second Palestinian uprising, people call it different names, the Al-Aqsa Intifada, the Intifada that came from Al-Aqsa, from the mosque, or the Oslo War, people in my community call it. Anyhow, for me, what it meant, I was in Old Pond still, and I was on the kibbutz and studying Hebrew. So every morning one morning we'd work in the fields, one morning we would be in the classroom studying Hebrew. And 8 o'clock a.m., we'd turn on the radio and listen to the broadcast and write down the words that we heard. And without fail, the words from those 5 months in 2000 were again and again: suicide bomber, shot, killed, wounded, stabbed, lynched. The violence of the second Intifada kind of overcomes life. and here a lot of things start shifting for me about how I see the conflict, how I view the conflicts. I think personally, after on kibbutz, I moved down to Gush Etzion, which is where Roots is based, between Jerusalem and Hebron in the Bethlehem Hebron district, and I started studying there in yeshiva, a religious seminary in a small settlement, a small town called Bat Ayin. I'll get back to that, but obviously a lot of things start shifting. And I know growing up till then, I'd read plenty about the conflict and, followed in college and the news and, the Arab-Israeli war, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And you assume that the conflict's constantly taking place between Israelis and Palestinians. But I'd say the first thing I realized is that's not true. That's much too abstract of a portrayal for who this conflict's between. The conflict takes place between a group called us and a group called them. That line is written in stone. There's no fudging your way around it. When I drive home from work, my car is a yellow license plate. And when I drive through a Palestinian village, it's clear who you are. If you're a Palestinian and you want to go to the sea, you're not going there because of who you are. You get stopped by the army. At all these moments, it's very clear. When the rockets were falling 3 months ago, it was very clear that that's them shooting at us. And us and them is just how violent conflicts take place. It's not politically correct, I suppose, but it's really reality. And for me too, those moments and those experiences in 2000, 2001, going to funeral after funeral, getting shot at for the first time, being stuck in Jerusalem because they're shooting at the road or the bus bombs going off. My cousin was killed in a suicide bomb in Haifa. And the conflict becomes not something that's going on out there, but is really in your heart and your bones and the fear. And of course, my politics start changing accordingly. And if the congregation was visiting us on site, we'd be sitting on a little plot of land right next to Gush Etzion Junction, right about halfway between Jerusalem and Hebron, and in the Judean hills. And on the one hand, when I moved out to Bat Ayin to work in yeshiva, on the one hand, there's of course the Jewish community, but there's something very powerful personally, because those are called the Judean hills. And anybody who's gone to a Jewish wedding has sung Od Yishama in the cities of Judea, Ba'arei Yehuda, V'chutzot Yerushalayim. And across the street from my bunk there was the remains actually of a Jewish town that they found called Tachlili. It has a name. It existed, I think, for over 400 years until the Bar Kokhba revolt. And my father's name is Judah. My great-grandfather's name is Yehuda. My great-grandfather's Yehuda. And these are the Harei Yehuda, the Judean mountains. It's an incredible sense of homecoming that land obviously holds for our people. But the land, if you know Israel, if you're in the Dead Sea, on the lowest place on earth, you look up to the mountain range. And you go over the mountains, you go down towards Tel Aviv and on the plains, and you look up and there's this mountain. And I really come to observe the land is divided in two in a sense. And there's really two core perspectives that everyone on this call probably views the conflict from, every journalist, Israeli-Palestinian sees. And when I was growing up and I looked towards our homeland from afar, I saw, of course, ancient Jewish history and modern Israeli history, and 48 war and 56 and 6 Day War and Yom Kippur War and Lebanon and the Intifada. And finally came that amazing moment in the early 90s of seeing our leadership, our leaders, our protector, our general, our hero, Yitzhak Rabin, with the arch enemy, with the terrorist, the hijacker, the militant. Or if I'll flip the tables, our freedom fighters, the Palestinian Yasser Arafat, the symbol of Palestinian Liberation Organization, the one who fought for our freedom with this barbaric general Rabin. Anyhow, these two leaders of our fight put their hands together, and they ushered in a new era of peace, of compromise, of land for peace, of two-state solution, of Oslo Accords, and a peace process. A recognition to even recognize the Zionist entity as Israel, to recognize the PLO as legitimate representative of the Palestinians. That had never happened before. And obviously there was lots of hope, and we sang the songs and we prayed and we thought we're walking into a new era. 28 years later, we can all acknowledge, of course, it hasn't gone as planned. But many people still view the land with the lens of a peace process. How do we judge the news? Is this good for the peace process? Is it bad for the peace process? Is what's going on in Gaza? Is the Israeli elections? Is the settlement being built? Is these overtures for peace? Is this change? And how does this impact the peace process? And that's how I came to Israel, with that hope for the peace process. But after living here now 20 years, but even after living here 6 or 7 years, the peace process, really? Imagine you're a Palestinian living the last 27 years of peace process. Before the peace process, Palestinians didn't need a permit from the IDF and the Israeli army to cross the Green Line and go to work or to go visit the sea or take their kids for a vacation. There was no need for that. There weren't permits. The separation barrier, the security wall that we have today, that wasn't here before the peace process. Obviously, we hear now the suffering in Gaza, the siege on Gaza. There was no siege on Gaza. There was no war in Gaza. And on an Israeli perspective, we look back, suicide bombings, which became such an item of fear and such a fear, The first suicide bombing was in 1993. That's the beginning of the peace process. When Hamas 2 months ago shut down a third of the country with a rocket fire, before the peace process, we occasionally had rockets from Hezbollah in the north, but to think where we are, peace process, is that what you call this? And who's our partner? If there's a peace process, that means between the us and the them, we can look across and say, here's our partner for peace. As an Israeli, we look across and we see President Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, Abu Mazen, who's been there too long, essentially. But anyway, I'll take him. He's one of the architects of Oslo. He indeed worked to end the Second Intifada. His security forces maintain coordination with Israel today to prevent violence. But at the same time, if I listen to him speak and tell his story of the conflict and talk about Zionism as a colonial entry into their land, declaring Hebron a World Heritage Site for Christianity and Islam, but can't even mention the word Judaism as part of that heritage. I see you can't even come with the terms of the basic. And if I go to the Fatah is our partner. That's the main Palestinian moderate party that's been our partners in the deal. And there's been some rough times, but I still want to look today and say they're still beholding to the Oslo Accords. But their Facebook page doesn't always bespeak that sense of trust or partnership. Meanwhile, Palestinians, of course, look at Israel. They looked at Bibi Netanyahu's reign for the last 12 years. And in Bibi's government, even Bibi himself wasn't a far-right politician. He was a center-right. But there are other ministers in the last government that wouldn't even say the word Palestine because it doesn't exist. So can you make peace with a government that won't even pronounce your name or that denies your essential story of who you are? So there's no peace process. There's no peace partner. And I think me, like many people by 2008, 2009, by the time I met Rabbi Adir, had crossed the mountains from peace process to the other side. On the other side, so what is this conflict for me? And for many, I think, Israelis and Palestinians, and I'm not talking about the objective definition of, is it a religious, territorial, ethno-national struggle? What does it feel like in our kishkas? And I think for many of us, it deeply feels like an existential struggle. That core Jewish question of survival, which has become a core Palestinian question of survival. We have nowhere else to go. The one place in the world we can call home, here we face. And I can speak obviously poetically about my connection to the land, what Judea and Sumeria mean to me. But I'll speak more on behalf of my cousins who are secular, who live in the center of the country and supported Oslo. And still to this day have no real sentimental attachment to holding on to Judea and Samaria forever. But they're terrified of facing a front in Hezbollah in the north, Hamas in the south, and the West Bank being controlled, which is 3 kilometers from their home. Who's going to be there? And that fear, that existential fear, has paralyzed the peace process on the Israeli side. And if it's an existential threat, that means it's us or them, and let the best one win. We tried peace. What did we get? And I want to examine here what that transformation's about. Why nice kid from Seattle, liberal arts education, compromise is the way to go, recognize there's two sides to really over my dead body, you're not pulling me out of my home, and for what? And I think it's less about putting on a bigger kippah or growing a longer beard. It's less about the politics or the religion that we normally point at. I think it's the experience. And when I look down my street and look at the neighbors, what the stories that every family has of bombs and attacks and violence, and what every one of those moments is deep fear and anger. Fear and anger are maybe not what we normally point to in the conflict, but I think that our voting public suffers them. Fear is a very regular part of life. When a siren goes off and you've got between 10 to 90 seconds to grab your kids at 2 a.m. and run to a bomb shelter, I don't really care what your politics are. You experience fear on a very core human level. And when I drive home, and when there's Palestinian kids walking down the street on the road, and there's a rock throwing or there's not a rock throwing, that moment of on guard that's constantly there. If you're a Palestinian driving by and you're stopped by an Israeli army searching for someone, and it's not you, but how are you going to explain to that without that language and that fear that comes up over and over? It's just a core part of experience that we all live with. And anger. Okay, anger is also to see the things that we see, the injustice that goes on. And I always say, if you put a protest for justice in Israel-Palestine and just put it up, I think everybody would show up. We're all looking for that word carries something that both sides feel they're being denied in some very core way. Asymmetries aside, and anger. I think for moving there, I did a pretty good job of holding on to these two sides. And it's true that a terrorist for us is a freedom fighter for someone else. But in 2010, there was an attack in the town where I lived in, and a young boy was murdered with an axe in the back of his head in a very brutal way. And I know in that attack, something, that anger, the ability to hold on to two sides was gone. And I have a simple equation that says anger plus fear equals hate. And I think so much of our societies are racked with that fear and that anger, which are experiences, but it doesn't leave with much political capital to resume negotiations or make the compromises necessary, do even the recognition that's necessary to restart a peace process. And so that's my outlining of a problem statement for Israel-Palestine. We've constantly reawoken traumas here. And that's what we're faced with. And for me too, it got the better of me. But I'll in the spirit of why I think also one of the right timings for this conversation today is 2 weeks before, now before Rosh Hashanah and Shuva. What does it mean personal truth? What does it mean national truth? I'll tell you, that period after that boy in my town was murdered was a time of anger and really hate for the other side. No space for their story. No need to listen, because that. Around that time, I came across the teaching in a Hasidic text that quoted from the Talmud. In our Talmud, it says, "Kol ha'ko'es ki'ilu oved avodah zarah." Anyone who gets angry, it's as if they're worshiping an idol. And that hit me. Maybe one of the reasons that, that reading a text like that intellectually, but to know you have anger in your heart, and that hit me, that this anger I have, what's it justified? It's for a good reason, but that anger, where is it taking me? What's it doing for me? And instead of me ruling myself, my anger in a sense is taking control of me. Sometimes it's voting for me. And I think that gave me a personal stop. And around the same time, some other things were happening as well. But I want to say this, that I think in order to talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict with Israelis and Palestinians, with Jews, Muslims around the world, that emotional level is there. And before you get to any issues, there's a lot going on there. And a lot of things are coming from there. The other side, I think, are some core questions that we have yet to come up with answers for. When I sit at home, I'm sitting in Tekoa, which is a town that Amos the prophet that lived in, that's mentioned through the Bible through and through. It's Jewish history there. It's everywhere you turn, in the stones and then the rocks there. So for me, there's not really a place that's more Israel than Gush Etzion. On the other hand, Gush Etzion is over the green line. If you claim Gush Etzion is Israel, then where's Palestine? And on the other hand, if we look to where the beginnings of Palestinian national identity and the first writings that talk about a Palestinian identity and developing, they're not from Ramallah. They're from Jaffa. And Lida, or Lod, was really the district capital for many years, the Ottoman Empire. And the heart of Palestine, I think, was definitely in those cities on the coast, in Akko and Ramla. But to say that Akko or Jaffa is Palestine, what is that? That's what Hamas says. And we've failed to, even after 21 years of peace or 27 years of peace process, we still can't say those things. And to this, I kind of found my way. And obviously, when Palestinians claim the land as Palestine, we respond with our historical truth, and we go back and forth. And this is an easy dilemma that we're all stuck in, or a lot of people in the conflict are stuck in. And for me, my answer was kind of challenged by my rabbis. And I'll close with this story here. It's Rabbi Menachem Froman, who was kind of an out-of-the-box figure, a settler rabbi who kind of led the resettlement of Gush Etzion in the mid-70s. And his widow, Hadassah, told me this story. She said, when we moved out to Migdal Oz, which is a kibbutz in Gush Etzion, she said, when we got there, they had a ceremony for the new rabbi welcoming a new town between Jerusalem and Hebron in 1976, the heart of Gush Emunim, the settlement, the block of the faithful, moving back to the land. She said, we got there and they showed us to our caravan, and they're there to take a picture. And I walked, and Hadassah said, I walked into that house with a sense of really stepping into the next chapter of Jewish history. 3 years after the Yom Kippur War, only 30 years after the Holocaust, I think we're rebuilding Jewish life here where it all began. It's just, what an amazing thing to be a part of. She said, but I turned around and noticed that my husband was standing outside. Menachem was outside. She said, Menachem, come in. They're waiting to take a picture. And he turned to me and said, I can't walk in this house. I said, what do you mean you can't walk in this house? We're home. We're home on the most epic level. I says, no. What's wrong? And he pointed at the door. And she walked outside and looked at the door. And on the door, there was a bumper sticker there posted. And she said, Menachem, you crazy? That's the slogan of the movement. Very famous bumper sticker. It says, Eretz Yisrael shayach la'am Yisrael. Right? The land of Israel belongs to the people of Israel. And he said, well, we're going to take it down? He said, don't take it down. He went to the sticker and played with it. And in the video, you saw me saying this to a group of Palestinian high schoolers. The Jewish people belong to the land of Israel. Not that the land of Israel belongs to the Jewish people. That our people belong. And to rephrase our identity in that way puts an entirely different music on the connection to our land. And I believe with all my soul that we belong to this land. That belonging is a very different way of speaking than owning. And I think Rabbi Fruman, more than anything, was a very devout Jew. And when I wake up in the morning, the first thing I try to say is, Modeh ani lefanecha. I acknowledge to you that this body you've given me. And the land's no different than that body. It's a body we inhabit. It's not ours. And you know, Israel before COVID welcomed, I think, 2.7 million tourists because Christianity belongs to the land and Islam belongs to that land and we belong to that land. So that rephrasing for me opened up a whole new way of living my identity and practicing my identity. And then came the work through Rabbi Fruman of meeting Palestinians. And Rabbi Fruman was notorious, of course, since the 70s for reaching out to specifically religious Palestinian leadership, but not just, including Arafat. And in a conversation between him and Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, who was the founding Sheikh of Hamas, Sheikh Yassin said to him, he said, Rabbi Fruman, what happened in Oslo is that your heretics and my heretics got together and signed a piece of paper. He said, you and I, Chacham Fruman, could make peace in 5 minutes. Rabbi Fruman deeply believed that we need to engage the religious aspects of our identity and our religious leadership if we want to bring peace to the people and have the buy-in. And it's kind of a hidden back door, this connection between Judaism and Islam, and using that to engage and reframe what we're all doing here in this land. And those are kind of the experiences that really peaked this transformation. And the next thing was, of course, meeting Palestinians. And I want to respect time-wise and pass on to Noor. But the first time I drove 3 Palestinians in my car to meet Rabbi Fruman, half scared out of my wits of what's going to happen around the next bend. But all of a sudden recognize here's people who are suffering because of the military conflict and what's going on. And on the other hand, they're partners. They're looking forward and not backwards. And that really sparked a whole world of meetings. And we'll get back to that in a minute now. And I'll pass on to Noor from a Palestinian perspective of what does it mean to come to a joint Israeli-Palestinian initiative in the midst of the post-Oslo realities. Thank you.
Thank you, Shaul. Hello, everyone. My name is Noor Awad, and I'm a member of Roots. And I was born in Amman in Jordan in the year 1991. I was born there for a Palestinian family. But I usually start my story by saying that my story started way before I was born. It started in 1948 when my grandparents had to leave their village in southwest of Jerusalem during the Nakba war, during 1948 war. My family became refugees and they ended up in a refugee camp here in Bethlehem, where I live today. My parents were born in Bethlehem, and after 1967, they found themselves under the Israeli occupation. And by 1986, my father actually decided to leave the country. He wanted to go to Jordan. He wanted to go originally to Germany, but he stayed in Amman in Jordan. My mother was there at the time. They met there and they got married. And that's why I was born in Jordan and not in Palestine. But in 1995, something different in this story happened. In 1995, we were in the Oslo Peace process. And Shaul talked about that. And during that time, the hope that finally this conflict is coming to an end, and there will be a peace agreement, and there will be an end of occupation, and there will be an independent state of Palestine. So all of that hope brought my parents back from Jordan to Bethlehem in the West Bank, on the hopes that the occupation will end, and then there will be a free Palestinian state. So we came to live here, and in 1995, or in those years between 1995 and the year 2000, I myself don't remember so much of the conflict. You know, back then I was still a kid. I was very young. I didn't really understood the complexity of the situation around me. But my childhood memories from that time, what I remember is the times when my father used to drive and work in Jerusalem. When we used to go to the beach, to Jaffa, to Haifa, to Tel Aviv. There was checkpoints, but I don't really remember having to stop and suffer at the checkpoints. So it was a different situation. I'm not saying there was no conflict or there was no occupation, it disappeared, but that was what I was aware about. And the year 2000 came when the peace process actually that's supposed to bring an end of the occupation failed. And instead of that, we end up in a second uprising, the second intifada against the Israeli occupation. Now, at that time, as Shaul described, was very violent. Things were in the second intifada very difficult. Bethlehem, the city where I live, went under siege for 41 days. Outside of my house, there was hundreds, if not thousands, of Israeli soldiers and tanks, shootings in the streets. My family was involved in the intifada. I mean, distant cousins were part of the second intifada. Some of them were injured, some of them got killed. And all of a sudden, I found myself living a different reality than the one before the year 2000. And I started to grow up and live this life here, my life in Palestine, as Noor, as Palestinian, and ask myself questions about this reality and who I am and why I'm living this way. By the time I was a teenager, we are in the age of the internet. So when I look around, I see that people my age, different places in different countries, they don't live under similar circumstances. They don't live under occupation, and they don't live under wars. So I say to myself, why I have to live this way? And it seemed to me that the answer is because of who I am and where I am, where I live. So who I am, I'm a Palestinian. But what does it actually mean? It meant to me that I'm a third generation of this long ongoing conflict that went for so long time, where my grandparents lost their home and they became refugees, where my parents were born under wars and occupation, and where I have to live this way, especially if I want to continue living here in Palestine. So naturally, I start to think that the solution, there is nothing I can do about the situation here. And what should I do is to move somewhere else, go to a different country, start a new life, and detach myself from everything here. But I couldn't just do that, because at the same time I was thinking, what is my responsibility toward the situation that I live? What is our responsibility? And by the word our, I'm referring to my generation specifically. So if I want to say that the past generations, my parents' generation and my grandparents' generation, if they failed, then what my generation is obligated to do to make sure that the future will be better for the next generations, for the future generations. So I start to ask myself about what can I do and what should I do, and what should my generation do to change this reality that we live in. And coming from the perspective and the reality of living under the occupation, I definitely have the idea that we need to fight against this occupation. We need to end it in order to get our freedom and to have a normal life. And I went to violence and I went to non-violence as well. I learned about both violent and non-violent approaches to resist the occupation. But in this reality, where I resist the occupation, the Israelis in my life are only the occupation. I mean that where I live in the West Bank, I live in Bethlehem in Area A. There are no Israelis. The only Israelis who come here are the Israeli military, the Israeli soldiers, when they come to arrest someone. And they came to my house to arrest my cousin 3 times. I see them at the checkpoints on the roads in the West Bank when I travel between one city and another. Also, there are Israeli settlers who are civilians, but they are part of the conflict. Those settlers are coming and taking over our lands. So that's how I met Israelis. I had no chance to meet an Israeli just as a human being. I always met them as an enemy. So I want to jump and go to the end of the story where I actually found about Roots and I came to join Roots. In 2016, I was guiding a group of American students. They were on a program called Middle East Studies. They were on a program actually that brings them to Israel and the Palestinian occupied territories for 2 weeks, where they spend equal time on both sides, listening to narratives on both sides, learning about the reality, about the situation on both sides. So I was just another guide who was supposed to take them to show them around. And I took them to Hebron, south from here. And I remember that day very well. I remember We started in the morning. We left Bethlehem. We drove past Gush Etzion. I showed him the settlements. I talked about the settlements and its effect on the two-state solution, on peace. We went to Hebron, and I walked them through the whole city of Hebron. We also talked about the settlements there. We talked about history. And then by the end of this tour, by the end of that day, before we leave Hebron going back to Bethlehem, we have still a last meeting to do in Hebron. And I always talk about this meeting because that was important that day for me on how I came actually to understand what Roots is doing, and to start deeply thinking about what I have heard at Roots that day. So I met with this Israeli activist, Israeli settler, who is talking on behalf of the Israeli settlers who are living specifically in the city of Hebron. So he's the speaker person of this community, of the Jewish Israeli community there. And he wanted to convey the Israeli settlers' perspective about the settlers' presence and the situation in Hebron. And we sat, and then he started to talk to us about his experience, about his life, about his personal story. And at the end of his story, he made sure to leave the group with two main ideas. The first idea was that there is no occupation here today. There is no such thing. We Israelis cannot be occupiers of this land. We as Jews, we are coming back to our ancestral homeland, and therefore there is no occupation. And for me to listen to such an idea was very difficult, and I basically couldn't really understand how he can make such a lie when it's very obvious. Now, I lived all of my life here, and I live under something called the Palestinian Authority today, which was founded by the Oslo Peace process. But I and the Palestinian Authority, we live under the Israeli military control at the end of the day. We live under Israel's sovereignty in the West Bank, under Israel's occupation. And this Israeli settler is saying to me that what I live and go through every day on the macro level, on the micro level, doesn't exist. There is no occupation. And then the second idea he said, there is no Palestinian people. There are neighbors, and they are Arabs, and they call themselves Palestinians, but there is no such thing. It's not a legitimate identity. It's not a real thing. They made it up just in order to try to delegitimize our Jewish identity and connection to the land of Israel. And that wasn't that wasn't the first time I hear such an idea. Actually, this is what we were taught in our schools, that this is what the Zionist movement believes, and this is what the Zionist movement did from the beginning of this conflict, denying our presence, denying our connection to the land. And I said to myself, I was like very frustrated after listening to him, and I left Hebron angry and frustrated. And if I wanted to meet an Israeli that would affirm every negative idea I had about them, then this meeting actually was the meeting that convinced me with every negative idea I had about the other side. So I left Hebron and I went on the way back to Bethlehem. I had to stop at Roots and to meet one of the Roots activists, but it wasn't clear to me what actually Roots is. I thought I'm actually going to meet with my group with another settler who lives in Gush Etzion. And he was a settler that lives in Gush Etzion, but Roots wasn't about the settlers. It was about, it's an initiative that brings Palestinians and Israeli settlers together. And hearing that for the first time, I was, I was shocked. What do you mean, settlers and Palestinians sitting together? Settlers don't want peace. Settlers want to take our land. Why there are Palestinians who are sitting with them? What they think they are trying to achieve. So it was a question. I have all of these questions. We went there on a piece of farmland, and we sat. We had this rabbi from Elon Shvut, Hanan Schlesinger, and he started to talk to us. And that day, Hanan explained very well, not only his perspective, and not only that just shared with us his personal story, but explained very well the situation. He was able to talk about both his side and my side. He talked about the state of Israel and the establishing of the state of Israel, but he also talked about the catastrophe that happened to my people in 1948. He talks about the living in Judea and Samaria, and he talks about the occupation at the same time. And for the first, I don't know, I left Roots that day thinking that this man is in a way contradicting himself, because he's trying to hold into two opposite things most of the time. But I didn't also feel that he is contradicting himself. I think I start to get his message, and he shared it with us at the end. And he made this metaphor where he said that in order to live in this land and to make peace, he have to enlarge his heart to accept more than just one truth, more than the truth on his side. And I was thinking about the things that he said about himself, about his truth, and about my truth. And I went back to Bethlehem that day, and I said, I must go back and learn more about what the people there are trying to do. And I went back and I met with Ali, the person who you saw in the video in the beginning. I sat with him. We talked. I remember we talked for like 2 days. And when I went back, and then I met with Shaul, with Myron, with Khalid, with other activists, and I decided to join. And this is how I understand the work of Roots. We understand that there is today many problems to talk about between Israel and Palestine. Border issues, refugees, settlers, violence, Jerusalem, terrorism, resistance, all of these things we can talk about it, and these sounds like the problems between both sides. But I came to understand that these are the symptoms of the real conflict. And the real conflict is who we are and what this land is. What's the story of this land, and what's the name of this land, and what's the identity of this land, and therefore, what is our identity? Meaning that we at Roots believe that the roots of this conflict is our identities on both sides and how we practice it. Therefore, in order to make peace, we have to look at our identities and try to fix it. Fix it not in the way that we need to leave it, but in the way that how can we practice our identities without having to live on the expanse on the other side or denying the other side identity? How can we create a future where both Israeli, Zionist, Jewish people and Palestinian people can live together at the same time, enjoying their identities at the same land, at the entire land? So that's how I learned about the work of Roots. And in another word, I will put it as Roots is not just working for making peace between two governments or two countries. Roots is trying to achieve reconciliation between two identities and two people. And that's how we are going to achieve peace between Israelis and Palestinians. So I believe in the message of Roots, and I believed in the message of reconciliation, although it sounds like we are jumping to the last level of making peace, because when we talk about making reconciliation, at the same time, the occupation is still going on, the violence, terrorism is still going on, the feelings of animosity and denying between both sides are still very high. So to talk about reconciliation now sounds like impossible to achieve. But this is, in my opinion, the most powerful way to start dialogue and to start a process to really solve this long ongoing conflict. So yeah, that's what Roots is. And this is me in a short way. And I think we can go now for questions. Do you want to say something about what we actually do on the ground, day to day?
Sure. Yeah. No. Great. Thank you, Noor. And Rabbi, before we move into questions, what does Roots do practically? What does the organization do? So I think what Noor and I both focus on, which I always feel is the last thing we do, which is creating discourse, trying to develop a new discourse around how we speak around this conflict that takes into account, that's built upon the identities at stake, the experiences at stake. And the way that Noor and I have kind of come to listen and think about these things has been through the years of these meetings and facing up. What's the context in which we face up? Well, this morning our WhatsApp was on the Israeli side was full of questions. There's 3 small Palestinian villages that have been without water the last about 6 days even. And trying to figure out why that's going on. There's some kind of disagreement between the Israeli Water Company and the Palestinian Authority, but trying to get involved to make sure that the people get water. In the last, about 2 weeks ago, there was a Palestinian boy was killed in a wrongful shooting by the IDF. So both Palestinian activists within his village and Israeli activists, both on both sides, trying to do what we can to keep the calm, trying to keep this from escalating. On the Israeli side, we managed to get a promise from the IDF that the family's work permits at least won't be revoked, which is the normal practice that happens after these things. In a sense, activism and local acts of solidarity and stepping in when we can, trying to make the changes where we can make changes. When we can't make changes, at least to be showing the message. You know, when a neighbor of mine in Tekoa was murdered 3 years ago. And of course, what shows up in Israeli media is Palestinian terrorism, the support in the street. But to bring a group of Palestinian roots activists who visited the family to the mourning tent and condemned the attack, of course, and the violence, but stood there with that pain, it was something that brought the mother to tears. Those works of solidarity and activism, I think, are kind of a core center of what Roots focuses on. And then, of course, with the biggest breadth of Roots programming is if you would have, in the middle of the West Bank, middle of Judea and Samaria, you would have come 3 weeks ago to our center, you would have seen 70 Israeli and Palestinian 5 to 9-year-old kids at a summer camp. Their staff were mostly alumni of our own young adult programs. Our alumni of the young adult program headed out yesterday for an end-of-year seminar program, kind of processing what's gone through this year, looking towards next year. Interreligious dialogue between local religious leaders, both Jewish Christian and Jewish Muslim. There's a women's group that's been functioning off and on over the last 5 years. Example, after the violence in the fighting that took place 3 months ago, so Roots' response, in addition to the pain and the prayers, was twofold. We actually, our Jordan Valley, and I'll get onto it, we have 2 functioning chapters now in different parts in Judea and Samaria, in the West Bank, by Jericho and in our Bethlehem, Hebron, Gush Etzion region. There's a joint memorial service for children that were lost in the fighting, put on by actually students that are part of a student meeting group we're running there. And we held a seminar. We held a 4-part seminar. And in the first lecture, Israelis heard a talk in Hebrew about what is Al-Aqsa, the mosque on the Temple Mount, what does Al-Aqsa mean in the Palestinian national identity? What's its place in the Palestinian national story? In Arabic, Palestinians heard a talk about what is Jerusalem's meaning to the Zionist movement. We then had a meeting for activists to kind of let people process and share what they went through and felt during the fighting. We then brought in Tabut Abu Ras, the doctor Tabut Abu Ras. He's a Palestinian of Israeli citizenship who works with a partner organization, Abraham Accords. He talked about the identity crisis within Arab-Israeli identity as Palestinian and both Arab and Israeli citizens. What does that mean? What is looking into that violence that took place within the Green Line in Israeli cities? And in the last session, actually, Noor gave a talk to Israelis explaining from a Palestinian perspective, how did we end up from what was going on in the beginning of Ramadan to the escalation to Hamas rockets and the fighting that took place. And he talked about what happened, and not just what happened, what does it mean in the Palestinian national story? Well, I gave a talk to young Palestinians about that same progression of events from an Israeli perspective. What did it mean to Israelis to see Arabs in the street breaking into synagogues and burning them? What does that mean on the Jewish story? So all this work of these programs of bringing meeting that leads to joint activism, that builds a kind of a new discourse and trying to share that is kind of at the core of Roots work. We're registered. We have a kind of a co-leadership that's taking place under an Israeli nonprofit in America. There's a Friends of Roots, which is a Friends of board that kind of helps us support us, helps with our speaking tours. And here we'll just open up for a conversation, question, wherever people want to take it. So thank you for hosting us.
Thank you so much, Noor and Shaul. And when you were both talking, I was just struck by how important what you're doing is. It really is. There's so much work happening around this issue in this country, around the world. But the grassroots level, what you're doing feels like it's very powerful and important and touching on the deepest level. And sometimes it feels like sometimes when you're very, very far apart, it's meet again somehow in the center. So there's a being there that's in both of your stories that is very powerful. So I wanted to start the questions by asking you, if you were to look around the people in your daily life and you were to make a pitch for what you believe in, how easy is it to convince other people? How hopeful should we be?
Mm-hmm. Important question. And the word pitch is really actually right. pitch is, I guess pitch is a marketing word. How do you make, pitch in it? And I think I could explain, I could put out roots in a way that 99% of my neighbors would just run away from it. This is traitorous. And I think I can put out on a pitch that I think 80% of them are interested. And it really depends how we phrase things. We're looking at this actually right now. That's interesting, and then finding the way, and timing is definitely a question there. Emotions that come up, what's been happening in a town, what's been happening in a community, to know when's the right time to break it and how to break it. So right, many of my neighbors, for instance, if you say the word Palestinian, I live in Tekoa. It's a settlement. It's a right-wing town. I think most of the votes in our town went to Naftali Bennett's party, with Likud, with the Spanish. The word Palestine, some people using the word Palestine has gone too far. How can you enshrine their identity when that identity was really built, against our identity? So what to do? So sometimes I think on the Israeli starting with the political talk is the wrong way to pitch it. But when we start talking about but when you get people in a reflective, talking about a casual conversation, things go. There's times of relative of upticks in violence and times of quiet violence and little violence. What's going on? Where is this going? What should be our plan? We want to be back here as the Jewish people return our land. What's going between us and our neighbors? And for me, I think playing on the local card is the strongest pitch. This is, peace working is not the work of people of leftists in Tel Aviv. It's peace working is our responsibility. We live here. We pay the price and there's no peace. It's up to us to build relationships and improve things for us and for our neighbors. And I think that's kind of the pitch that generally it more opens when you take it. And I think for this, it's something interesting to reflect on. I think on the Israeli side, there's the political issues are harder the political questions are harder on the Israeli side. But giving people a sense to be engaged in their surroundings, and also here I'll point out something that kind of noticing the shift in the generations. I think there's an older generation that has a lot more connection with Arab life, with Palestinian world. And there's the younger generation that lived much more that kind of came of age in Oslo, who really hasn't known anything but the separation. I think that post-intense fear that's there. Whereas I think the older generation a lot of times has a little bit more nuanced perspective. They remember times when they remember walking around in Bethlehem as Israelis, and that being something that happened was a normal thing. The younger generation cannot imagine being in a Palestinian town. So I think that's also something that I'd noticed about how to make the pitch. But that pitch, I think, is about if we want to talk about living here and being here and not seeing an end to the settlement enterprise. So how do we build relations? There's needs on both sides. How do we increase cooperation and start with those things? And from there, I think people come to grapple with the questions of the political identities and the more challenging questions. I think through there, I can give an example. We had a music therapist teacher from Efrat. And she wanted to do a project for music therapy with Israelis and Palestinians. And we said, it's a little bit tricky to do such a sensitive project. It's not really facing up to the issues, but it happened. And I know from the Israelis that got involved with them, a lot of them, through those personal relationships, all of a sudden found themselves understanding when Palestinians say the word occupation, they mean that there's no water in their village, that there's Israeli armies, demolishing a building here because they can't, and there's no way to get them a permit. So words, political terms, they wouldn't have been able to use otherwise. But through the personal experience, they learned it from the inside, and then it kind of opened up a backdoor to understanding what the importance of the work is on the political level. That was too long of an answer, and I'll try to be better next time.
Yeah, that was a full answer. I would say very similar to what Shaul said. Depends on the way how you actually market it. Depends on the way how you talk to the people about it. If I would go to my society and say that, hey, I'm sitting with settlers, come join me, no one would they would think I'm crazy, I'm out of my mind, traitors, and most people will be against me. But if I take it into more very local, focus on the local level, and invite people to meet neighbors from the other, even settlers, but still neighbors from the nearby settlement, and talk about very local issues, and not identity and politics and things that it doesn't seem like it will. People don't have the trust in the other side that they will change. It will change. So that's how roots grow, by focusing on the local level, and that's how we talk to our society, and also being aware and sensitive. Sometimes you can do much more, talking about and marketing roots, and sometimes you have to slow down a little bit and maintain the relationships that exist and maintain the trust that we build. In May, for example, during the events of April and May, The focus was on improving the communication between the members of Roots already and listening to each other, which in my opinion, like improved the trust between both sides.
I think something also that I think the word peace is such a buzzword, but it's so far from people's experience. It's the wrong word to use. And I'll give an example. During the fighting in May, Roots is in a sense, we said obviously we can't stop the fighting. We talked about, should we start a hunger strike and demand the end of hostilities? Who's going to listen to us? But we said we all have a responsibility within our villages, within our towns, within our schools to do what we can to keep tensions here lower. And a whole bunch of stories came to us of Roots activists, Israelis and Palestinians, who were intervening to stop things from escalating in their towns. At a certain point, I had a list of 6 or 7 really powerful events that were there, and I put it on the email list in my town just to say. And I know a lot of people in my town, like exactly, we know Shaul in your dialogue meetings, they hate us, it's never going to change. Da, 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 da. But I remember I got a mail back from a woman in my town who's not a Roots supporter. And she said, Shaul, thank you so much for writing this. I want to believe that there's people in the village that are human and care about their children like us, and you restored my humanity. You restored my faith that there really are. And it was because we were talking about things that save their lives. The same thing that do Israelis want peace? I don't know, but are the Israelis working to bring back water right now? Are the Israelis working to gain building permits and to support us getting building permits? So translating the word peace into the values of peace and then into the actions that actually express what that would look like. I think that's part of the work that actually is the best pitch. Something like that. Yeah.
There was a follow-up question about like if our families encourage the work that we do. I would say that in my case with my family, they at the beginning, because I do a lot of these like geopolitical tours and guiding, foreigners and talking about the occupation. So they still see that this is part of that. And I, had a conversation with my mother about this in general, and she's not, she don't think of everyone on the other side as bad. She knows that there are good people, and but she would like, for example, like my family would be like asking me to be careful when I do this work. They will have a lot of suspicion about like about the work in general, but at the same time they know that there are good people on the other side, and mostly they form their opinion because of, in a way, as Shaul said, like they look at what the occupation is doing, the government on the other side, watching the news, and that's how they are affected or they make their opinion. But I would say, my family encourage the work that I do, but at the same time still like skeptical and suspicious in a way. Yeah,
similar. I mean, I think like my wife sometimes is, she's scared. Sometimes she's worried. Like, you answer your phone. What's going on? Everything okay? There is an element of that, a little bit of the fear. There's also, I have some family members in the Gush who were at some point were more involved in coming and then kind of kept their distance. I have a cousin who he's always happy to help me out from afar, but he doesn't. He keeps his distance. I think from the political stuff. He's a doctor. He's happy to help write prescriptions and gain medicines and stuff when I turn to kind of for medical help for Palestinians are working with or things like that. I think so. I think there's some of my family supports and has a hope. And I have a cousin whose son was killed in an attack, and it's not something that he gives you a blessing, but someday you're doing crazy work.
Thank you. So I'm going to here's a second question. Lori asked, have you had events like this with any Palestinian and Jewish diaspora communities to explain the goals of Roots?
So in former good times before COVID, and actually hoping to, speaking tours in North America was something that Roots, not Noor, myself, Hanan Schlesinger and Shadi were doing, but hopefully actually Noor and Hanan, Rabbi Hanan will be on a tour in November. And in those cases, I'd say 70% of the venues are in Jewish communities and synagogues, a smattering of mosques and churches. That is something, and then we also host a lot of visiting delegations to our center, which I've spoken to hundreds of groups from everything from interfaith missions to the Holy Land, to Christian pastors and to student groups and to APAC meetings and left-wing groups and right-wing groups, like a whole gamut of people that we do engage with around the world. Because I think maybe more so if pointing to is, you're right, the discourse around the conflict around the world is as polarized as it is on the ground. Sometimes it feels even more. And I agree that I think there's a tremendous lack of nuance and the tremendous phenomenon just of taking sides in the sense of right and wrong side. And it's sad watching. I think a lot of groups kind of come to us looking for some way of presenting both sides in a way that's not just about blaming or pointing out how bad, but actually grappling, I think, with the issues at stake.
But also not I would say not so many Palestinians that we actually like, Palestinians in diaspora. I mean, there are some who heard about us, and there are some who, you know, attended some of our talks, but still it's not that big number.
I think I'll say about that. I mean, I'd like to say, I think so much of the world is functioning under the Oslo paradigm. Oslo Accords set the terms for what is peace, and under Oslo Accords, anything over the Green Line is a celibate. It is supposed to be removed. Part of what Roots is doing is trying to create a new paradigm around that we need to seek a new way. But until that new paradigm there, that's definitely part of the biggest challenge, you know, from international discourse of the conflict is how can you even talk to settlers? You know, how can you give settlers a place at the table? They're the problem. And it's our sense that if we can reframe politics in a way that's more attendant to both Palestinian and Israeli identities, perhaps we can change what that means, at least that designation that in order to make peace, the Jews can't live here and the Palestinians can't live here.
Thank you. So I see a question from Sarah. I think it's a really deep question. So she's a therapist, and one of her family she works with is Palestinian here in Chicago, and she wears a Star of David necklace, and she was asked if she was Israeli. She said, no, I'm Jewish. And the family asked her, well, what is Jewish? And Sarah asks, how could she not know? She always thought the fighting was religious, not only about the land. Where am I wrong? And then to me, that question is also talking about kind of basic education. And do you have any thoughts or experiences related to that?
Yeah, I would say there is a powerful religious dimension in this conflict, but I personally wouldn't say that this conflict in its core a religious one. I'm a Palestinian secular, and many of my Palestinians also have my opinion, either if they were like secular or religious. Now you have Hamas who basically focus on and the Islamist movements who focus on the religion and put the religion in the core of this conflict and in the core of our cause, and they don't separate religion from identity. But I think that the overall experience of the Palestinian people with Jewish religious and national symbols became very, there was like, in my opinion, there's like confusion. When I see the menorah or when I see the Star of David, for a Palestinian, those symbols are immediately representing, you know, Israel, and it's connected to the conflict. Before it's connected to Judaism as a religion or to a Jewish history. That's how Palestinians, in my opinion, interact with these symbols because they became part of the conflict, and my people see them as, you know, as symbols of Israel or Zionism, and you know, most of the Palestinian people by religion are Muslims. So, and from my experience in the school and education system, we know very little, in my opinion, about Judaism. We only know about Judaism from a shallow perspective, from a Muslim perspective. We know about it as a religion that predates Islam, and it's connected to Prophet Moses. And you learn a little bit about like the history of the Jewish people in the or the stories about Jewish tribes or Jewish people in the Arab Peninsula and today's Saudi Arabia. But that's it. There are Palestinian Christians may have the chance to know a little bit more about like Judaism and the Jewish people, but also from a Christian perspective, from, you know, the Old Testament. But in general, yeah, I'm saying that because you know, to become a tour guide, going to a tour guiding school, I had different education from the schools. We had like we had to learn more about like the Jewish history, as well as the Muslim and the Christian history of the land. We touched these issues, we learned more. And this was for me like an eye-opening before I joined Roots, years before I joined Roots to start to learn about the history of other people on this land and other religions. So yeah, that's my answer.
I mean, one thing it really speaks to just how, I mean, it's something that was really drew me into the work was recognizing, we live with a sense that what the basics of Judaism are, of what Israel is to us, is something we is a take for granted. But when you think about it, of course, the question of what's this between Judaism, is Judaism a religion or a nation or a civilization or a people? They're not so simple to answer those questions amongst ourselves. And I really realized we have a lot of work to do in the Palestinian authorities, not necessarily teaching the kids the same story that we would teach about who we are. So that, and vice versa, of course. My sense of what is a Palestinian has been greatly enriched, of course, by meeting Palestinians who define it for themselves. And there's so little of that work going on. So Sarah, I imagine this family probably has little to no education that you would call it, to define ourselves. And obviously, as a therapist, there's probably places which are professional to step into and not. But the level of not understanding who the most basic things about the other people are is over and over and over again shows up in this conflict. I think Rabbi Deer mentioned working with Yossi Klein Halevi. I think we hosted Yossi Klein, who wrote a book a few years ago called Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, and we hosted Yossi out to give a talk at Roots live in front of about 60 Israelis and Palestinians and talk about his process of writing the book. And he opened the talk with, I think it was very poignant. He said, in the 100 years of our conflict, I don't think any of us Jews ever actually bothered to write in Arabic an explanation of what the heck we're doing here. We just assumed you guys know because it's true. It's our truth. And I think there's something very real in that approach of needing to go back to some basics about it and make space for the other side's identity as they see it.
If there are any other questions, you can also put your hand up, and I'm happy to. We can also unmute you or put it into the chat. I have one question. If there's no others at this very moment, where are you trying to go with all this? What are you trying to do? Where can it all take? Are you just trying to create more and more connections between people and see what happens with it, or are you trying to eventually even get into talking about political ideas to solve what you're doing, to solve the conflict? What is your end goal, if there is one at this point?
Sure, there is. Yeah, I mean, we could do another presentation kind of on Roots theory of change, and use kind of that as a way to talk about it. Listen, Roots, from the beginning, we're recognizing that there's a political level which needs obviously a lot of change and movement, but we're working within civil society, and we made our choice to stay working within civil society for a couple of reasons. One is that I don't think civil society is without power or agency in this conflict. One of the problems with working on the political level is you say, but how's that going to work on the ground? The level of, and I think people who look at the conflict and analyze it recognize, some people learn from Northern Ireland. And in order to reach that Good Friday Agreement that relatively put a political solution to a conflict that's been going on for a century and cost many people their lives, there was called the International Peace Fund that invested billions of dollars into exactly the work we're doing, grassroots local initiatives between local religious leaders, Protestant, Catholics, between school works. And that work on the ground is going to be critical for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, no matter what the political solution. I think Roots also recognize I think what we developed is a model, which is about focusing on very local associations. And the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is impossible to grapple with. It's too big. You have Iran, you have the US changing administrations, you have the EU, you have the politics, you have intra-Israeli and intra-Palestinian conflicts. All those things make it feel very little hope you could ever do anything about it. But when it comes up to you living in your town and there's a town next door, and what goes on the road between you, between the store owners, between the schools, between the water infrastructure, all of a sudden you start regaining ability to make some change on the small level. So Roots, Roots' vision here is to keep on growing these new branches, local associations, Israelis and Palestinians, starting on the most simple levels that we can to get our foothold. But for instance, in the Jordan Valley, where we started about 5 years ago with our second branch, now there's an ongoing student group there. There's work between Israeli and Palestinian farmers that are also working on. They've been reaching out and actually combating some of the extremist kind of settlement, the kind of extremist settler violent groups, and actually working both with the army and engaging them in trying to kind of change things out there. So this kind of very grassroots approach is for me, it's about a network of people across the land. And And perhaps as much as the groups do amongst themselves, it's also a statement to our societies. Look, Israel, Roots hosts over 2,000 young Israelis before they go to the army every year. And they come out on their trip to the territories to understand the conflict to Gush Etzion. And they'll meet there with a religious Israeli who believes on the one hand on the Jewish story and connection here, but the other says, you as a soldier on that checkpoint are going to be the representative of the Jewish people to all Palestinian society. And how you act there and how you treat people with respect, without respect, is as much going to gain us security or not as whatever you're going to do with your gun. So that charge, kind of pointing that back to awakening these questions again in our society, I think is also a critical part of what Roots is trying to do, to just increase that scope and visibility. And I think, and I'll also say another thing that Roots is doing, the discourse, the way, in the sense that Noor and I are talking about the conflict. In the last 2 years, we're getting more and more invitations and kind of a breadth of civil society and political kind of think tanks and new initiatives. We're doing some work with the Harvard Project. We're doing with Van Leer Institute of kind of reimagining peace in the post-Oslo breakdown, and also reimagining peace with real attention to the identities, to the religious identities and national identities that are here. So I feel in that way, Roots is gaining some exposure and traction and kind of affecting the people who are trying to reconceive the political process as well.
Wonderful, thank you.
And somebody's holding their hand. Yeah.
And I think Noor, did you want to go ahead? Noor is about to say something.
No, it's okay. You can go ahead with it.
Okay, Yaakov, I'll get to you in a second. I first want to answer the question. I want to ask a question that Alan put in the chat, which was speakers. You talked about meeting with delegations, with NGOs, with organizations from all around the world. I mean, does that really help you find common ground, or is it just make it so much more complicated because you have so many cooks trying to cook this, in the same kitchen, and the impression that there's no other conflict that gets so much attention. And what I also hearing you two talk and have that interaction in myself as an Israeli Jew born in Jerusalem, when I have that talk with Palestinians too, I feel it's so powerful when it's just local, one-on-one. You don't bring in the whole world around you. But on the other hand, what do you think about that involvement of the rest of the world and organizations and all of that?
You go for it.
I would say my answer is yes. Some and many times the involvement of this conflict from different countries and regional powers and world powers is actually making this conflict hard to be solved, and it's affecting this conflict in a very negative way. And ideally, I think that ideally we should be able to figure it out ourselves. We should make a solution ourselves. But at the same time, I think that we do need help from outside in order to go through the process. I cannot just assume that Palestinians and Israelis alone will be able to achieve a solution to the conflict without help at all. So I would appreciate, if there was a help, whether that's on the political level or on the grassroots level. At the same time, I understand that many states and many entities are involved here for their domestic politics and for their own interests. And that's what makes the conflict sometimes worse. And then you have the international law, which is really, it's a big part today of this conflict, in my opinion. In our perspective as Palestinians, we do today talk a lot about the international law. We do look at the international law as a guarantee for some of our rights. But again, at the same time, I feel that what we need is that we need to be able to talk to each other more as Palestinians and Israelis, on both the political level and on the grassroots level. And at the same time, I think we need help from outside.
For me, I think Roots doesn't take its lead from any of those organizations. Roots, the activists on the ground and the very local conversation is what determines our policies. I think, if anything, it's the chance to engage and host those organizations as opposed to, and it's many times for us, give our critique against them. and it's a chance to challenge some of the assumptions they're coming to the conflict with. If it's about BDS groups and saying that the only way to bring it is boycott and to ignore, in a sense we're saying, well, the only way to move forward here is actually to engage. There's other perspectives about how. So I think we a big part of our hosting those groups is also some of them is just giving people a glance into the conflict, but a lot of times there's an exchange there. For instance, I think there's Americans for Peace Now. I just saw that there's 2 people associated with Roots are actually giving a talk on Americans for Peace Now. They're a presentation. Americans for Peace Now is not interested in engaging with settlements or the settlers in a way that hears their side. But I think in their process of looking at where the conflict stuck, what are these perspectives, trying to bring those voices out as a part of the conflict, is something that Roots is helping, trying to gain and affect the way that people around the world are talking about the conflict. So being a part of the discourse is not. I hear what you're saying. We could definitely. I think there is too many people meddling in the cook, but I think as long as we maintain our sense of working on the ground from what we see as where we need to go, and having enough of what to say to share with visiting organizations or other perspectives, that's part of the conversation around the conflict, I guess. Even sometimes it feels frustrating.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, we have Yaakov. We had a question, and then we'll wrap Morris's. It says Beverly, but Morris's question into a conclusion. Yaakov, go ahead.
Yeah, I've this past week I've donated and pledged quarterly $18 towards Jewish Palestinian Arab Israeli dialogue, and so I think that there is a great possibility that that there can be peace, and I've donated towards the Roots before I have towards politics here in the United States. So I do have faith that peace can be accomplished in the Middle East there.
Thank you, James. Yeah, thank you. And that's obviously been an important part of how we keep the work going. And I think there is actually growing. Political analysts are saying the same thing. The U.S. passed this MEPA fund this last year, which is actually going to be really the first international serious investment in grassroots work and civil society work. And I think it's thank you. And not Beverly, but I don't know your real name behind Beverly. I often say that Roots is a prayer in action. There'll be, I don't know if there'll be peace. And Rabbi Fruman said that's really God's, peace is God's work. We have a lot of responsibility and changes to make and work to do on the ground. But absolutely, v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, bakesh shalom v'rodfeu, seek peace and pursue it, even when you don't find it. It's really, sometimes it seems Sisyphean, and sometimes it feels like you're holding up the world. It really works on both those poles. So yeah. Trying to make the Torah come alive there. I would say I put up the link to our Facebook pages. There's a Friends of Roots. We also send out a quarterly update, kind of updating things that are going on the ground, events happening, and hopefully the winter tour. People are interested in getting on that list. It's about one mail every 3 months, or not much more than that. Feel free to I guess to write me or to send it to Rabbi Adir, and you can pass on to me. I'll put her name up here.
So thank you very much to both of you, to everybody who attended today, and I feel this is a beginning, and so many interesting directions were brought up when you talked about looking at different aspects of Judaism or Islam or the identities, Al-Aqsa, the importance of Al-Aqsa, the importance of that area explained to different areas. I would be more interested in hearing more, so maybe we will look into that. I know you've done those kinds of programs before. And anybody who's here today, if you'd like to hear more about this, please send me emails so we can begin to explore that as well. And as everybody's been saying, thank you for your work, shukran and toda, and it's such holy work and so very much needed, and feels so important from where we are thousands of miles away, and for all of us to be able to help by supporting you, by learning and educating ourselves more, so we can educate others more and feel hope in our own hearts, and also spread hope to other people, and with a prayer to the Creator that that fear and hate can be shattered, and that there can be something new come up, and that these kinds of connections can lead to the tearing down of all of our barriers that we have between us one day, inshallah. Bezrat Hashem.
Amen. Amen. Thank you, Rabbi Adir. Thank you, everybody, for coming and taking your Sunday morning to hear us. And yeah, if you're ever visiting, also welcome to be in touch. Noor's a great tour guide, and you can welcome to have coffee at the center and join in.
That's great. On our next congregational trip, we'll definitely make it a stop.
Great.
Right. Thank you. Thank you both. Thank you, Noor. Thank you, Shaul.
Bye, Noor. Bye.
Bye, Shaul.
Bye, Noor. See you soon. Hope. Bye, Madia.
Bye. 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 Bye, Shaul. Bye, everyone.